Welcome, Tera.
First off, just thank you so much to Design Reality and to the previous two speakers. Really happy to be here. So I'm going to start this off with a really apt quote, I think, from Buckminster Fuller. If you're not familiar, he's an architect, theorist, author, did a lot of crazy magical things, and he didn't really limit himself to any one field, so he's kind of a man after my own heart. So a little background on me. I have a background in writing, graphic design, architecture. You know, as the introduction said, you know, I really work at the intersection of screen and space. So for the last 5 years, I've really been exploring about, you know, how digital and our physical lives might overlap and interact. I was previously at Wieden & Kennedy in their lodge in their creative technology group, and now I have the pleasure of being the design director at Torch. The problems I solve, really it's where there's few existing design frameworks, and often they involve emergent technologies, which is why I really love working in augmented reality and at Torch. I'll talk a little bit about Torch in a moment, but just in terms of what we're going to talk about, title of this presentation is We're All 3D Designers Now. I'm going to talk a bit about why mobile AR is important and why it's different. I'm also going to talk about, you know, why it's been so difficult for designers to really break into augmented reality as a medium. I'm going to talk really quickly about Torch and how we help there. And then the real meat and potatoes of this presentation is really about the skills as a designer from the 2D world and how they translate into 3D. Composition, hierarchy, material storytelling, all these things still matter, so please take a deep breath. I'm also going to hit on a few key technical constraints and concepts that you'll need to learn. So let's start off. So mobile AR, there's 1 billion devices that are AR capable right now. So that's really the form factor that we have. In the future, we'll have more accessibly HoloLens, lightweight glasses, maybe even contacts, but really the reality of the current and near future of AR really hinges on the experience for mobile. So at a very basic level, mobile AR can really be thought as a series of layers that are constantly interacting. So we have 2D on-glass UI elements, computer vision via your mobile device, we have computer-generated objects and UI, and then we also have the real-world objects and spaces. And AR, personal opinion, I think it's going to revolutionize many fields, but UX and UI probably represents the biggest growth opportunity for designers. And really these use cases are just the tip of the iceberg. I think most cases will emerge as designers ideate beyond sort of the obvious applications of gaming and entertainment, which is really what we're seeing now. And I think one of the main reasons we haven't seen huge involvement from designers is because of this, the wall of pain. Few professionals have scaled this, and thus a majority of designers aren't participating in the creation of AR. This sort of convoluted diagram is the result of interviewing hundreds of designers who are trying to prototype and iterate in AR and VR. So the diagram really details the barriers, huge learning curves, and frustrations that designers face daily. And really sort of that's the tools, which have a steep learning curve, and for the most part are all production oriented. Creating assets, they can be hard to come by. And prototyping, generally it barely works, and those prototypes are really hard to share and collaborate on. Which is why it's really where Torch comes in. Ultimately, making a prototype and exploring an idea is a pre-production process. It's one that requires experimentation, flexibility, and easy sharing for feedback. And that's really why we built Torch. I think simply put, Torch is a cloud-based 3D design and prototyping platform, and it's focused on making augmented reality accessible to all, particularly to designers from 2D backgrounds, and allowing them to tap into the power of 3D and AR. So with Torch, you're designing a device, and you have the ability to get comfortable in AR and really just demystify the medium. We offer fine-grained control models, animations, complex interactions, all without having to code. So let's give you a little taste of that. Okay. This is a really quick prototype that our navigate. And ultimately, instead of giving step-by-step instructions for folks that were visiting our office, he created this simple wayfinding prototype to guide people to our office. He ended up posting this on Twitter and got a lot of folks who sort of made the assumption that, you know what, he had just filmed the hallway and then he had overlaid those digital elements in post-production, so like After Effects, Premiere. But ultimately, he did this in real time using Sketchfab models, homemade 2D signage, and interaction triggers, and it was all done in Torch, I think in about a half hour. So if you're curious about Torch, we were doing demos, but if the Torch team could raise their hands, feel free to go back and talk to them after I'm done chatting. Otherwise, you can grab it on the App Store. It's completely free. Right now, we're only supporting iOS, but we will be tackling Android soon. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this presentation. I want to talk to you about some conceptual-driven AR UX concepts. And right now, the tools are just one barrier to designing an AR. The world of 3D can be super intimidating. And right now, the UX of AR is completely wide open. At best, we have a handful of general guidelines and considerations, so there's much to be discovered. So what that leaves us is a huge opportunity for designers to define the medium, and really, you know, I think AR will have far-reaching impacts into every industry, which is super exciting for designers. Ultimately, we need more designers experimenting and working in AR to define first-in-class experiences. Really, what does the UX of AR mean? And ultimately, the folks we need to have like intimate understanding of narrative principle, space, hierarchy. These aren't sort of radical concepts if you come from a design background. So let's get into it. So first up, we have world layers. The environment becomes another layer in your design, and it should always be considered. And as such, you should take time to plan the environment you're building in. What this means is you need to consider where your end user will view and participate in your experience, and how. These considerations really parallel fields like cinematography with composition and framing, architecture with materials and lights, and graphic design like hierarchy and wayfinding.
All right, started.
Next up, we have annotation. So the basic use case of AR is annotation of real-world objects. We do this in environmental design and architecture all the time. So the mechanism that AR uses to do this is called image tracking, and it enables us to latch on to objects that exist in the real world and attach computer-generated objects to them. Next up, 2D and 3D blocking. So similar to UX and UI, it's faster and cheaper to mock up objects to block out your experience and in your intended flow. You know, as with film and UX design, you want to create a pathway and affordances that guide the participant along your experience. And really, like any design medium, when you're starting out, you don't want to obsess over the minutia before you actually design the interactions with the participant. Guidelines, similar to graphic design, there are guidelines to help you out. These are really just sort of skimming the surface, but you're not going to be starting from zero or reinventing the wheel. I think Google's AR guidelines, you know, primarily are common sense, but they're really important to start there and understand while you're concepting and iterating on device. Lastly, we have human-centered design. So users are going to be active participants, but in augmented reality, they're actually interacting potentially with their entire body. So when you're designing an experience in AR, it's important to consider, you know, how will people use this? How will they interact with the environment? What limitations can I reasonably expect my participants to have? And how can I design for them? And apart from general accessibility, mobile AR requires you hold the device in your hand. So you have to account for physical strain on the body. So I wanted to go over some key UX concepts that are more technical and constraint-driven. I could go on and on about design principles that actually connect to 3D, but I think there's just a few technical guidelines that we often see trip up designers who are new to 3D. So first, we have origin point and anchors. The project anchor establishes the origin point of your design. So this is where the X, the Y, and the Z axes meet. Every object you place, be it a 3D model or a 2D image, is placed relative to the origin. So it's effectively your project center. You know, in the near future, we're going to have persistent anchors in the same physical location. So if you close a project or you have somebody else who opens your project, all of the objects will be locked to that same physical location. But right now, ARKit and ARCore don't necessarily support that. Z-axis. So this might be a no-brainer, but it's worth mentioning. Designing for AR requires us to consider depth, and it's really it's an opportunity that I think a lot of designers who are new to 3D completely forget about. So it really depends on which tool you use. It might be called the Y or the Z, but the concept is still the same. Instead of being locked in width and height, you're now given full access to the third dimension. So occlusion and illusion. This example is actually from Niantic AR, who helped create Pokemon Go, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So a sense of realism in AR is greatly affected by psychological constructs that we use to model the world around us. So basically, we expect things to behave in a real world in a certain way, and when they don't, that sense of realism is completely broken. So occlusion is a major component of how we make sense of the world around us, but actually, most of the tools don't support it just yet. Something you want to potentially think about and design around. Lastly, parallax. Also see this trip up, folks. So most folks see with two eyes. It's great for judging depth. Close an eye, and then it gets harder to tell sort of two familiar objects where they are, if they're similar in size, or are they really far apart at different sizes. Mobile AR suffers from the same problem as well. So the camera is monoscopic. So objects are viewed in AR, and they sorry, pardon me. So the camera is monoscopic, and ultimately we need other affordance to help viewers make sense of the size and position. So here we have the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which is super far away, but it actually looks like it's very close to this woman who's holding up with her foot. So sort of design considerations that you want to think about to help users, lighting and shadow, coloration, and saturation and lightness. So I know that was a ton, but I wanted to really give you some guideposts to be working with. So please go create, talk to us, check out Torch, and thank you so much for having me.